Preston Manning, thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Let's start out with your advice to Prime Minister Trudeau. Now with this minority government and no representation in Alberta and Saskatchewan, what do you think he should be doing to try and reach out to Alberta and Saskatchewan?
Well, I think he should do more than reach out. I think he should address the root causes of the alienation that's occurred, a complete rejection of his party and his candidates, and the fueling of separatist sentiment, which is growing every day here. I think you should address the root causes of it.
And they would be?
Well, there's a number of things. If you ask Westerners what constitutes a fairer deal within the Federation, they'd mention the need to reform equalization. The equalization process has been completely unfair to Alberta and Saskatchewan. They want unobstructed transportation corridors to the Atlantic and the Pacific so you can move interior resources to tidewater and world markets. They want a removal of barriers to trade within Canada, free trade within Canada. Want balance rather than extremism on the environment and the energy front, and a limitation on federal spending in areas of provincial jurisdiction or joint jurisdiction unless you get the consent of the provinces affected. Those are 5 major things that would address some of the root causes of this alienation. And I think the Prime Minister should address them rather than talk about more consultation and more discussion.
Okay, if we take one of them, the Prime Minister the other day was very clear in his press conference in saying that Trans Mountain Pipeline is going ahead, and he's already going to be investing $4.7 billion and then more on building that pipeline. Does that not satisfy the West in terms of one of those basic conditions?
No, the fact that he would even think that would satisfy the West indicates how much out of touch he is. Trans Mountain should have been built years ago. And the fact that maybe they're getting around to it now, that hardly addresses the problem. I understand there's been international investors at some of these meetings where the pipeliners are trying to attract investment to Canada. And one of them got up at that meeting and mocked the concept of Trans-Canada. He said, Trans-Canada pipeline, Trans Mountain pipeline. You Canadians can't trans anything. You can't build pipelines or infrastructure across your provincial boundaries. The Chinese can build infrastructure across 10 countries, and you can't even build infrastructure across 10 provinces within the same country.
Okay.
That's the situation that he's coping with. And sure, of course, Trans Mountain should go ahead, but it should have gone ahead years ago. That won't begin to address the alienation or the feeling that he is out of touch.
In terms of a solution, in terms of who he might be naming as an interlocutor, because as you know, he will have no ministers from the West. Does that help? I mean, any advice in terms of how he could get people who have credibility on the ground?
First of all, if you want to find out someone who represents the West and has an elected mandate to do it, talk to Jason Kenney and Scott Moe. Talk directly to them. They're the ones that represent these interests. Secondly, if you are trying to get someone into the cabinet indirectly, at least get an elected person. If you want to talk to a senator, talk to Senator Black. He at least was elected to represent Alberta in the Senate. But first of all, I say talk to the people that have a mandate to speak on these things, which is Premier Kenney and Scott Moe. And don't just have discussions. Talk to them about action on these items that Westerners want action on.
Okay, I want to flip the issue on its head, and I want to ask you if there's this Western alienation, and if you have Liberals with no seats in Alberta and Saskatchewan. The flip side of that is that the Conservatives did not make the national government. They didn't get elected. So let's look at the Conservative campaign and Mr. Scheer's campaign. You've experienced being shut out when you get to the Manitoba border. What could the National Party, the Conservatives, have done differently this time to have made inroads in the West? I mean, in the East, they generally were shut out at the Manitoba border.
Well, I think one thing, and this doesn't just apply to the Conservatives, is to convince voters, particularly in Ontario, that their economic future is tied up with the economic future of the West. If this energy sector is constricted further, the way it is constricted now, Ontario is going to be hurt by that, not just the West. There's the producing sector in the energy sector, but there's the energy manufacturing sector. a lot of which is in Ontario. There's the energy knowledge sector, a lot of which is in Ontario. So I think one thing that can be done is to show people in different parts of the country their dependence on economic prosperity in other parts.
I'd like to get your impression of.
The
Sorry.
other thing you could do, you could go even further east. The equalization formula, Alberta, since that inception, has literally put in almost several $100 billion. And so any province that's receiving equalization should recognize that it has a dependence on the prosperity of the place where those revenues are coming from, and a lot of that coming from the energy sector. So I think making those connections would be helpful from the Conservative standpoint, but from every political party's standpoint.
Okay, also from the Conservative standpoint, though, I mean, as you know, there's going to be potentially, well, there will be a vote on whether to hold a leadership review of Mr. Scheer's leadership. Where do you stand on that? Some Conservatives are saying that Mr. Scheer has had his chance and he's not going to win the next election, that he should go.
I think they should give him a chance to see what he's been able to do. I mean, he did better in this election in increasing his position, and the Prime Minister's position went down. So relatively, I mean, the Conservatives didn't form a government, but they didn't do that badly. The second thing, and I noticed there was no comment on this at all by the panels on election night, nobody noted that there are now 7 provincial governments that are conservative oriented. Manitoba, or Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, New Brunswick, and depending on how you define conservative oriented, Quebec and Prince Edward Island. If you have the official opposition in Ottawa, which is a strong opposition and is conservative, that starts to form a coalition and better links with those conservative-oriented provincial governments, that combination is as strong as the Liberal minority government. Okay. And I think Mr. Scheer should be given a chance to assemble that kind of a coalition. He's a peacemaker and a reconciler. He's not a polarizer.
Okay, if we look at the vote, 2/3 of Canadians in the last election voted for parties that supported a form of carbon tax. You have spoken about the need for the Conservative Party in Canada to have an approach to carbon pricing. Did the policy as it was put forward in this election of the Conservative Party of Canada, did that hurt them? Do they need to rethink their carbon policy?
Well, I think Conservatives need to be stronger on environment protection generally. But I don't think just the Conservatives got to think their policy through on that. I think the other parties too. I've been saying if you've got a choice between trying to deal with environmental problems through massive micro and macro regulation by governments, which requires great interference in the economy, versus using a pricing system, that I think a pricing system is preferable. But the other thing I've said, and this is hardly ever reported, for that pricing system to work, it has to have certain characteristics. It has to be revenue neutral. It has to be accompanied by a reduction in regulation because it's supposed to be a substitute for regulation. It has to be subsidy free. And it has to be accompanied by efforts to get your trading partners to come along in some way, shape, or form so you don't penalize yourself. None of these systems, not the cap and trade system in Ontario, not the Trudeau carbon tax, not the carbon tax instituted by the NDP in Alberta, have anywhere near those characteristics. So I think the carbon pricing systems that are in place now will not succeed. And so everybody better think through their approach on that issue if they're going to use that mechanism.
Okay, just in just a word, do you think the Conservative Party of Canada should rethink and try and reformulate its policy before the next election, whenever that comes?
I think the far more important thing is that the government has to rethink its position. It's the governing party. It's got to rethink its position on equalization, got to rethink its position on corridors to the Atlantic and the Pacific and the Arctic, rethink its position on spending and taxing in areas of provincial and joint jurisdiction. I think that's where the rethinking has to happen if you're going to actually address the problems facing the country and not just the West.
Okay, Mr. Manning, thank you very much for taking the time and speaking with us.
Okay, thank you.